The reason why we think that slavery is wrong, that human rights exist, that humanity has intrinsic value, and that children should be cared for, this comes out of the Christian tradition.
All right, let's see it.
In the ancient world, they were beat routinely. They were turned into sex slaves as children, boys and girls. It's horrifying to read. Slavery was just the norm.
And slavery would remain the norm within Christianity for well over 1,000 years, and all of these things would continue to happen, and people would appeal to the Bible in defense of slavery and those things happening.
No one ever questioned the idea that slavery should be abolished until the Christians came on the scene. The first one to say slavery should be abolished was Gregory of Nissa, working on what he was learning in the scriptures and reading Paul in Genesis.
So I want to highlight 4 objections to the rhetoric that is being presented here. First, Gregory of Nissa did not actually call for the abolition of slavery. He condemned it as immoral and unjust and a violation of God's created order, and vehemently so, but he didn't actually call for its abolition. And while it may sound like I'm splitting hairs, that's actually an important distinction, and it flatly undermines this rhetoric, because the claim is that he was the first to call for the abolition of slavery, and this is supposed to support the argument that the abolition of slavery comes out of the Christian worldview. Had he actually called for the abolition of slavery, he would have been the first, and that would have been significant weight added to the argument that the Christian worldview in and of itself, in isolation from all other worldviews, is the primary catalyst for the abolition of slavery. But he didn't call for its abolition. He condemned it as immoral and unjust and a violation of God's created order. And he was not the first to do that. There were representatives of different Greek philosophical schools that had already condemned slavery as unjust and immoral and a violation of God's created order prior to Gregory of Nyssa, in fact, prior to Christianity. We can go back to Aristotle and find him in his book On Politics referring obliquely to other philosophers who rejected the justice and the morality of slavery, and he uses that as a springboard into his argument for some people being born by nature slaves. Stoicism would reject that when it develops this notion that anyone with a rational soul is by nature free, and slavery is just an outcome of social convention and social practice. And we actually see this reflected in Nyssa's argument when he says in his 4th homily on Ecclesiastes that man is by nature free. This brings up another objection. Gregory of Nyssa was not objecting to slavery solely because he was reading Genesis and Paul in isolation from all other things. He was reading them through the interpretive lenses of Greek philosophical schools like Platonism, like Stoicism, like anti-Aristotelianism that emphasize human nature and freedom and natural law and things like that. And you're going to find every time you see an abolitionist take within Christianity that it doesn't occur in isolation from the influence of those Greek philosophical ideas. And so Christianity certainly is an ingredient in abolitionism, but not the only ingredient. It's not the main catalyst, much less the only catalyst for abolitionism. These things don't occur without some of those Greek philosophical frameworks. And this brings up another objection. We have within Stoicism this principle of all humans having a rational soul, being by nature free. And that results for some Stoics in an argument against the morality and the justice of slavery, and for others it doesn't. And the point I want to make here is that just because you have a principle that can lead to the rejection of slavery does not mean that it is inevitable that it will, or that it has to, or that that's the only valid interpretation or outcome of that principle. That principle can exist for over 1,000 years without inspiring an objection to slavery, which is what happened for the consensus view within Christianity. It existed just fine, even in light of those Greek philosophical principles, without deciding, hey, we have to get rid of slavery. And so in order to argue that Christianity was the single catalyst, independent of all other worldviews, you kind of have to suggest that it's inevitable that that principle leads to the other thing. but it's not. And that's one of the things that undermines this argument that, well, yeah, it took 1,500 years, but it had to get there. It was inevitable that it was going to get there. That's just not supported by the data. Connecting those dots requires certain contexts, certain circumstances, certain decisions and choices. And the entire history of Christianity shows that it took an awful long time for enough people to arrive at that non-necessary conclusion to actually change the consensus view.
And that slowly began to change. And you can see it in the scriptures. Like go to like Ephesians 6, where Paul says, slaves, obey your masters. But no one quotes right after that in Ephesians 6, where Paul says, and masters do likewise to your slaves. So he doesn't outright say slavery should be wrong, but he undercuts any sort of like reason for slavery to exist. If masters need to do exactly to their slaves as slaves doing, there's no institution of slavery at that point.
So, two concerns with this bit of rhetoric. The notion that what the pseudo-Pauline author wrote here in Ephesians 6 undercuts any reason for slavery to exist or denies it a moral foundation requires a specific interpretive outcome, and specifically an interpretive outcome that the majority of Christians would not agree with for well over 1,500 years, not until the 19th century, after an awful lot of societal change and after the specific question of the morality of slavery became one of the most acute sociocultural crises of the last 500 years. That does not support this presupposition that that interpretive outcome is an inevitable one, or is the only legitimate one, or was the intended meaning all along. Those conclusions are not supported by any data. Those conclusions can only be presupposed. And this brings up the second objection. The notion that what the masters are supposed to do to the slaves is this service with enthusiasm, thereby somehow undercutting the reason for slavery to exist, doesn't fit with how the majority of scholars agree this text was intended to be understood. For instance, we can look at Stephen Fowler's New Testament Library Commentary volume on Ephesians, the paragraph at the bottom. This section concludes with a brief address to slave owners, continuing to call them Kyrii, masters. Paul admonishes masters to do the same to their slaves. Doing the same may refer back to serving wholeheartedly in verse 7, by having both parties serve each other. This would certainly fit with the call to mutual submission that started this passage in 5:21. It seems more likely, however, that Paul is urging slave owners to extend the same disposition of integrity and singleness of heart that they owe to Christ to their slaves as well. And we can look at Darrell Bock's Tyndale New Testament Commentary volume on Ephesians as well. At the very top, he's just finished quoting verse 9, then says, the call to the masters is that they should have the same respect and awareness that the Lord is watching how they act in their use of authority. This awareness matches the sense the slaves are to have as they serve their masters. And you can look at a variety of different commentaries. This is going to be the predominant view of what was initially intended and initially understood for this passage, which means that reading that we need to be inevitable to insist that Paul is the origin of the abolition of slavery is not supported by the data.
So the Christian values slowly start to undercut it. And this is why Tom Holland says Christianity was like a depth charge. It took a while for these explosions to go off and spread.
So again, it sounds to me that this argument is relying on the presupposition that these interpretive outcomes that bubble to the surface in the Renaissance and the Enlightenment were inevitable, or were the only legitimate outcomes, or were what was intended all along. And I'm not sure that that's what Holland meant when he said that the theology of Paul was a depth charge that sent out these ripples that weren't felt until the 11th or 12th centuries or the Renaissance or the Enlightenment. Certainly Paul was an ingredient in the recipe that would result in this opposition to slavery. But again, Christianity was not the only ingredient, was not the primary, much less the only catalyst. These things also required the influence of Greek philosophical frameworks related to natural law, related to the notion that humanity is by nature free. This is why those ripples don't make it to the surface until we begin to recover Greek philosophy at the beginning of the Renaissance, and then we have the Enlightenment, where it is influencing deism and rational religion and things that are departing from the Christian mainstream. So there are a lot of influences going on. And when you look at the 19th century, how Christians are reinterpreting the Bible because they don't like slavery, what you see is that it starts with an intuitive disgust, usually precipitated by proximity to the abuses of slavery. And then you go looking in the Bible for authorization for that intuitive disgust. So as usual, opposition to slavery is something that starts outside the Bible and then goes to the Bible for the proof text, which requires renegotiating with the text. And this brings us back to my metaphor of the Lego bricks theory of hermeneutics, where the Bible is not a full, complete edifice that just tumbles out in one piece when we turn over the toy box. We have to construct the meaning, and we can use the pieces in whatever way we like. And we can see Christians experimenting with a variety of different ways of putting those pieces together before finally landing on something that the majority of Christians can get behind, not because it's a perfect argument, not because it's unassailable, but because enough people can say, I'll buy that, I can get behind that, because it is plausible enough for the majority of Christians to agree. And then it becomes the biblical authorization of abolitionism, not because it was there all along. It wasn't. And so abolitionism in no sense is baked into the Bible. It would take almost 2,000 years for Christians to say, yeah, I can get behind that reading. And again, it would take slavery becoming one of the most acute sociocultural crises of the Western world in order for Christians to feel incentivized to intuitively accept this edifice that was constructed from these Lego blocks. There is no syllable of the Bible that in any way, shape, or form whatsoever questions, condemns, prohibits, or precludes the practice itself of buying, selling, and owning other human beings. That is condoned, if not endorsed, from beginning to end. And it would take almost 2,000 years for slavery to become such an acute socio-cultural crisis that the majority of Christians got together and said, we need to do something about this, renegotiated their understanding of the Bible, and arrived at a conclusion that overturned the Bible's unilateral condoning of slavery. And one of the ways that renegotiation authorizes and defends itself is by coming up with increasingly sophisticated arguments for the notion that that reading that we arrived at was inevitable, or what was intended all along, or the only legitimate interpretation. And the reality is just that it's not, it never was. That is a renegotiation of the text, because all of the text is negotiable. And the fit for this video has been The Land Before Time